Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. Before we start tonight, we have a dedication. One of our regulars, Louis, lives up in the Golan Heights in Katzrin, and it's his father's yurtzeit. His father's name is Leib Kalman ben Binyamin, and Louis, his Hebrew name is Eliezer Ephraim. He is dedicating the class to the memory of his father. May our learning tonight be a merit for his soul. He should have an aliyat and neshama. Right after the class, I'm going to ask Louis to say a few words about his father, and it all should be for an aliyat haneshama. This is the third class in our series on Ma'aseh Merkava, the workings of the Chariot. I'm going to just take 5 minutes to review how we got to this class tonight. So the text that we're dealing with, anyone who is new to the class, if you want to get a Tanakh, a Bible, and open to the first chapter of Ezekiel, that is the text that we are using. We've only gone through 5 verses in the first 2 classes. The first class, we just did an overview of what is Ma'aseh Merkava, what is the workings of the Chariot, and also Ma'aseh Bereshit, the workings of creation. These are names given to our mystical tradition way before we had the word Kabbalah. The mystical tradition in great measure was referred to as the workings of the Chariot and the workings of creation. We're dealing with Ma'aseh Merkava, and we mentioned that most people associated, for good reason, with the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. But we made a very important point that it is not exclusive to this. It's just that Ezekiel described what he saw of the inner workings of the world, of the upper worlds, according to his description. But we said Isaiah gave a description of the Chariot. Zechariah gave a description. One person that we didn't mention, and it's important to mention, is Daniel. Daniel also gave a description of the Chariot. And what it means, a description of the Chariot, is where these different prophets or those with divine inspiration, what they achieve through the mystical tradition, the meditative heights that they reached. And then these different people, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Yeshayahu, describe what they saw, but each one was a different description, because Ma'aseh Merkava is not something that you can box. It's an experience of the inner dimensions of the world, of creation, of the Torah. That is what Ma'aseh Merkava is. And so we learned the first few verses where we saw that Ezekiel was in exile when this prophecy came to him. He says that the heavens opened up and he saw visions of God. And last class, we talked at length about he saw 5 different things as part of his elevation, we'll call it, to the upper worlds or the inner worlds. And so in verse 4, I'll just review it for us. Ve'ereh v'hinei ruach sa'ara ba minat safon. And I saw, and behold, there was a whirlwind coming from the north, a non gadol, a great cloud, the Eish mitlakachat, and a flaming fire, the Nogalob Saviv, and it was surrounded by an aura of light, umetocha ke'ena chashmal mitocha esh. And in the midst of the fire, in the midst of this whole vision, he sees the appearance of Hashmal within the fire. We're not going to go back over. Everyone is welcome to access the class from last week on YouTube, our website, on Telegram. All of these you can WhatsApp. But we described there's two different commentaries. One is the whirlwind and the great cloud and the fire. These were all signs showing the upcoming destruction of the temple. Remember, Ezekiel is giving this vision 10 years before the destruction of the temple. And all of the prophets, including Ezekiel, are warning the people that if you don't change your ways, this is what will happen. And so God grants him a vision of seeing these destructive energies that are going to play themselves out if the people don't change their ways. And as we always learn, it didn't have to happen. If people would have changed their ways, it wouldn't have happened. But then we got into great depth of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's explanation that the 5 levels here are 5 levels of, we'll call it impediments, that a person needs to go through to get to a clear place of meditation. And these are all obstacles. Anyone who has attempted to meditate knows it doesn't happen with the snap of the fingers. Our minds are working. There's all kinds of stimuli, all kinds of input. Our mind is running like 24/7. And so these different, the whirlwind and the cloud and the fire, these are different stages of intellectual and emotional and bodily obstacles that we need to get to until we can calm down enough to enter into a meditative state. And then the rest of the class, we began discussing this word chashmal. The entire class tonight is going to be on this one word. And the reason is if we want to understand Ma'aseh Merkava at all, this is the main word to understand. It's not just another word in a verse. This word is considered the most mysterious and paradoxical of all words in the entire Bible. And that is because it deals with paradox. And as we began to learn last week, and now we're going to continue, when we divide the syllables, so chash means silent, and mal means speaking. So that is not a contradiction. As the sages say, this represents possibly a type of angel that sometimes is silent and sometimes is speaking. But we learn that the real secret of Hashmal is that it's simultaneous. And this is what we call the sounds of silence, where you have two opposites that seem not inclusive of the other. If it's silence, there's no voice. And if there's a voice, there's no silence. But here, Hashmal represents the speaking silence, the sounds of silence. Or, as we said, the experience that Elijah the prophet had, when God came to speak to him, b'kol d'mamadaka, in a thin, silent voice, because he was also experiencing the essence of paradox. And I'll just end with a review here at the Baal Shem Tov. So he explained, anytime you have opposites, there will always be an intermediary that can bring them together. This is one of the greatest secrets of Judaism. You see behind me, you see a picture of the Magen David, where you have two intersecting triangles. One triangle is going up, and the other triangle is going down, complete and total opposites. And yet they're melded together, welded together into one symbol. And that's called bringing opposites together. So the Baal Shem Tov read chashmal, chashmal, mal. Why? Because the word mal, which means here speaking, has another meaning, and that is circumcision, brit milah. And so the Baal Shem Tov said that every process will go through a three-pronged process. And he called it submission, separation, and sweetening. That we first submit ourselves to a task, which already is a great accomplishment. How many times do we decide to do something and we simply don't carry through with it? So submitting ourselves to a task is a formidable first step. And then there is separation, where we have to separate on a constant basis those things that will help us accomplish what we want to do, and those things that are going to take us away. That's called separation. And the last one is called sweetening, hamtaka, where we accomplish what we wanted to, and we are happy with what we did. How many times do we set a goal, we put a lot of energy, and then we get there and it's like, that's not what I thought it would be. Like, I did it, but it's not what I had hoped for. So the sweetening is being happy with what we accomplish. And the true sweetening is to thank God for the energy, the inspiration, the determination to have accomplished it. So the Baal Shem Tov says that this applies to chashmal mal. Chash is silence, means the silent determination to submit oneself to a purpose. And the mal, circumcision, is literally a separation. We cut off the foreskin. And then the third mal, which is speaking, is the sweetening, that we can express it and we're happy with how it comes out. So that was all a review. And now we're going to take Hashmal to much deeper levels, because what I'm saying here is, in a certain way, the entire tradition and inner dimension of the mystical tradition is symbolized by this single word, chashmal. So let's see what we're going to do with this. L'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. So first we have to point out something very important. Chash is also the first two letters of choshech, darkness. Chash, choshech. This is very important because this is going to take us back to the first day of creation. In the second verse of the Torah, darkness, choshech, is already introduced. It does not say that it was created. It's there. Choshech is there. In the third verse, God says, let there be light, and there was light. So here, if you look at the word chashmal, chash represents darkness, choshech. Mal, which means speaking, represents light. And what's the connection? Is because the first explicit creation that God spoke into being was light, and it came through speech. And therefore, it says in Tehillim, Petach Devarecha Yair, the opening of, we're speaking to God, the opening of your words illuminate. So there is a very, very strong intrinsic connection between light and speech. Between light and speech. In fact, this is just an aside, that the word for healing in Hebrew is refuah. If you take the letters of refuah and you permute them, it's or peh, the light of the mouth. So we'd ask, what does that have to do with refuah? Well, I know that we have a number of doctors watching tonight. So healing in a great measure comes through the channel of the doctor. It's what in modern terms we call bedside manner. If anyone, and unfortunately I've experienced this far too often, when you go to a doctor and they're just actually mean. You're just one of the people on the list that they have to see. They have no bedside manner. They have no sympathy. They have no compassion. And like you walk out of there just feeling just horrible. Or the opposite, where you have a doctor that expresses, or peh, the light of the mouth, expresses compassion and interest and the real desire to help. It makes all the difference in the world for the patient. All the difference in the world. So back to the first day of creation. So we have choshech and or. And if you look at the first day, other than the first verse, which says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the rest of the first day is all about darkness and light. And after the creation of light, it says that God looked at the light and saw it was good. And then it says that the darkness and the light were intermingled. And God separated them and gave to the light day and to the darkness night. And the day ends, Vayhi erev vayhi voker yom echad. It was evening, it was day, one day. So what we can learn from this is many people, if you ask them, what is darkness? Many people would answer the absence of light. That is not a wrong answer. In a certain way, that's a correct answer. But in our mystical tradition, and not just that, as we're going to see, there is a reality of darkness that is independent of light. And it's not necessarily bad or evil. Many times we associate darkness with the opposite of light, purity, goodness, spirituality, soul, etc. And darkness is evil and negative and depression and sadness. And there is a reality to that. But there's also a reality that the darkness comes before the light. And that's why in chashmal, first it's the darkness, and then it's the light. So now let's go into, we'll call cosmology here, Kabbalistic cosmology, where we're going to see alternative stages of darkness and light. Before there's creation, no time, no space, nothing other than the reality, the essence of God. So we term this the Ein Sof, the infinite being of God, the infinite reality of God, infinity. That is represented by darkness. That is represented by darkness. And it says in the Psalms, Psalm 18, the 22nd verse, he places his secret in darkness. That this darkness is like we'll call the darkness of the womb. From the womb, all life is born. So when we say the Ein literally means nothingness, infinite nothingness. But we don't mean nothing. We mean just the opposite. It is the birthing place of everything that would come. And that's what we call the infinite, the Ein Sof. Then there is the Or Ein Sof, the light of the infinite. But first comes the darkness. First comes the Ein Sof. Then comes the infinite light of God. And then, according to the Arizal, in order to create a finite world, so God contracted his infinite light, and we get what's called the vacuum. That is darkness again. And into that darkness, many of you will recognize this because we've mentioned this many times. Into the darkness, God shone a ray of light into the middle of the vacuum. And from that ray of light comes all creation. So here, if you followed, we have darkness of Ein Sof, light of the Or Ein Sof, the darkness of the Tzimtzum, and the light of creation. And this is all represented in Hashmal. First, the darkness and the light. And we know that the Jewish day, it starts from the evening, like it says in the Torah. And it was evening, and it was day. First, day 1, day 2, day 3. So here we see the darkness is, in this context, is very positive. We also have the idea that God created the world black fire on white fire. What does that mean? We know that we have this expression that God looked into the Torah and he created the world. And then we have what are called the 10 expressions of speech through which God creates. That again is the connection of speech and light. So what does it mean, black fire on white fire? So again, usually we'll identify white fire with positive, and black fire is perhaps negative. But when it says that God looked into the Torah and created the world, so the black fire are the letters of the Torah. You open up a Torah scroll and you see that the parchment is white and the letters are black. So even though we might think that it should be white letters on a black background, because isn't light the main thing? But here, this black fire actually illuminates even more than the white fire. And David HaMelech in Psalms expresses this. This is in Psalm 139, 8 through 12. I'll read it in English. This is really one of the most amazing few verses in Psalms. So King David says, "If I ascend into heaven, there you are. If I make my bed in hell, behold, there you are. If I say, surely only darkness will cover me, and the light be night about me, even the darkness is not dark for you, but the night shines like the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you." So here, what David is expressing, that when we talk about darkness and light in a primordial way, they're both positive and they're both shining. And there's even a place to say that the dark light shines more than the light light. Now, this is played out at Mount Sinai. In the descriptions of what happened at Mount Sinai in Parshat Yitro, and then later in the book of Devarim, in the Etchanan, when it describes the physical phenomena that were happening. So it says, in one verse, it says, and there was fire all around the mountain, and there was smoke all around the mountain. And in one verse, it says that God spoke from the midst of the fire. But in other verses, it says, and God spoke from the midst of the darkness. So it looks like a contradiction. But from God's perspective, like we just read from David HaMelech, the darkness shines like the light. For God, they're both shining. They're both shining. And that's the secret that at Mount Sinai, because remember, we were told that the seven heavens opened up. We experienced synesthesia, the crossing of the senses. All of the worlds were, all the dimensions were melded together. And so in that sense, the darkness and light were the same thing. Again, all of this is to explain chashmal, silence and speaking, which means at a deep level, darkness and light. Later in Kabbalah, we have the concept of light and vessel. Both of them need each other. You can have all the light in the world, but if you have no vessel to contain it, it's like trying to pour water into a cracked cup. All of the water will just flow out of the cup. It will not be able to hold it. So the light needs the vessel, and the vessel needs to be filled with light. This is also represented in Hashmal, because Chash, the darkness, is really the vessel. And the Mal, representing speech and light, is what fills the vessel. So here, to put this part of the class together, what we're seeing is that chashmal represents not just opposites, but it represents the unity of opposites and the ultimate unity of all paradox. And here I have to mention that the reason Hashmal, and we should know that the only place in the entire Tanakh that Hashmal is mentioned is by Ezekiel's vision. It's never mentioned any other place. And what it represents on the deepest level is the essence of God being paradox. One of the most important teachings I ever heard from Rav Ginsburg. It sounds very simple, but it's so profound. He said that one would expect that the closer one gets to God, the more pure one is, the more holy one is, the more spiritually mature one is, everything would become clearer. Like all the mysteries of life would become clear. He said it's actually the opposite. He said because the closer you get to God, the closer you get to paradox. And the closer you get to paradox, until you can until you can work through it, the more complicated everything gets. But one of the ways we refer to God, and it's connected to the word chashmal, is God is called Nimna HaNimnaot, which means the paradox of paradoxes. Nimna HaNimnaot. The other way we refer to God is Nosei Hafachim. He carries opposites. Because for God, paradox isn't what we think. On an intellectual level, we think paradox is something that can't be solved because you have two opposite, mutually exclusive realities that you're saying are both true at the same time. Whereas the Western mind is, if you give me two mutually exclusive opposites, the Western mind says, just tell me which one is right. They can't both be right at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. They cancel each other out. So which one is right? A Jewish way of thinking is completely opposite. And we have the phrase, an extremely important phrase, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. This was applied to a disagreement between Shammai and Hillel. And they presented two absolute opposite explanations of what they were speaking about. And the Jewish way of thinking is these and these are the words of the living God. They both can be true simultaneously. When it gets down to Jewish law, we choose one or the other. That is true. We choose one or the other, but we never nullify the other opinion because there are points of truth in it, and we recognize that. We may not choose it as the way that we act, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have truth to it. Okay, now to continue, we're talking about opposites. So if you take the word chashmal, you'll see that the two middle letters are shin and mem. Shin always represents eish, fire, because it has a shin, eish, fire, and mem always represents mayim, water. These are opposites. In this world, water puts out fire, fire makes water evaporate. That is, in a certain way, pretty mutually exclusive. But if we look at the first verse of the Torah, what heaven is called Shemayim. Shin Mayim. The shin is fire, and then the actual word for water. So heaven is, as we said, for God, fire and water are not mutually exclusive. In this physical world, they manifest as opposites, but in heaven, fire and water coexist perfectly. So when we say that the essence of God is paradox, what it begs us to do is to look deeper than opposites, and like the Baal Shem Tov, look for the middle that will draw them together. And that's why, again, if you look at the Magen David, you'll have the triangle going up starts with two opposite points, but then they meet in one point, or the opposite starts here, and then they meet in one point. So here, in the word chashmal, not only do we have the opposites of silence and speech, but we have the opposites of fire and water. Now, if you look at the word Mashiach, we'll notice that 3 of the 4 letters of Mashiach are 3 of the 4 letters of Hashmal. This is not a little, I'll call it coincidence. It's because one of the tasks of the Mashiach is to bring peace to the world. Now, here, according to our tradition, there are 70 archetypal nations, 70 archetypal languages. Right now, I think in the United Nations, I think there's something like 193 countries represented. I think I'm just using an example, in India alone, I think there's hundreds of dialects. There are a couple of major languages, but there's quite literally hundreds of dialects. So one of the tasks of the Mashiach, when we think about who's going to come and bring everyone to the table, who is going to be able to speak to everyone in a language that they can understand, who is going to take 6,000 years of nation fighting nation and make peace between them. So the fact that 3 of the letters of Hashmal are the same as Mashiach is a very intrinsic and deep connection. Now the chet, I mentioned the shin and the mem of Hashmal. The chet, the letter chet, give me 1 second here. It's important that you see how a chet appears in the Torah, because the chet is actually a combination of 2 letters, a vav and a zayin. That's how a chet is written in the Torah. And it has this little, it's called a choteteret, a little connecting bridge between them. And why this is important, because again, we're talking about chashmal as being the epitome, the archetypal example of opposites. So here we have the shin and the mem are opposites, but the chet also includes the vav always represents the masculine energy, and the Zion is the feminine energy. So the Chet is a combination of masculine and feminine. So here we have a whole other layer of opposites that need to be brought together. Or as the modern book tells us, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. like it's two completely different realities. But of course, we're meant to bring them together. It's not, all of Judaism is based on what's called shalom bayit, on making peace in the home between feminine and masculine. Okay, we have one more section here, and we're going to, at least for now, to complete our look at Hashmal. As for the future, the next class, we hope to do around the next 10 verses, because they're all dealing with one subject, and that is the vision that Yechezkel has of these angels that have 4 faces and 4 wings. And we're going to delve very deeply into that reality, especially the number 4. Because what I'm trying to explain here is that what Ma'aseh Merkavah is, it's kind of like the inner dimension of Ma'aseh Bereshit. Ma'aseh Bereshit is how God created the world, the flow of the creative process, the divine creative process, the elements of creation, the evolution of creation, the inner reasons for creation. Ma'aseh Merkavah is going inside and trying to understand how does it work. Now that we have a creation, what are the principles? What are the energies? What are the forces that make it tick? And the reason I'm spending so much time on Hashmal is everyone remembers the first letter of the Torah is a big bet. Bet, of course, is 2. And we start off creation with the idea that God has created something, as it were, outside of him, outside of infinite, finite. God had to contract his infinite being in order to make a place for the world. And that first bet is telling us that even though there is nothing other than God, ein od milvado, it's all from God. Nonetheless, God created a dualistic, opposite, bipolar world. Our whole reality is based on opposites. But our job is to see the oneness that is always present in the multiplicity. And so the word Hashmal, the reason it's so important, because this is taking that bet of Bereshit, and now it's trying to flesh out the reality of those opposites, the reality of paradox, and what brings opposites together, and how does the whole machine work. So that's why we're spending so much time on Hashmal, because it is the point through which we can see the perspective of virtually everything else within what's called Ma'aseh Merkavah. And we're going to see the same thing with the number 4. That we'll get to the next class. Jerry, we have questions afterwards. We have a whole discussion group. So hold your question. Okay, this will be the final section of this. And the numerical value of Hashmal is 378. 378. The Arizal, and we discussed this in the first class, when people try to translate the word Hashmal into English, so in many different Bibles, it's expressed as a color. And there's a tradition that also that's he saw this energy, but the energy was in the form of a color. So the Arizal says that from the fact that the word for Hashmal equals 378, he says that there are 378 hues of color on the spectrum. Now, this doesn't mean that it's exact, but what the Arizal was saying is that we experience light, and then it took Newton to show us that the colors of the rainbow are included in the light through a prism. But those main colors, if anyone's gotten, these packs of Crayola crayons, so you can get them like 24 or 48 or like 120, because you can take the color blue, and there's so many shades of blue. And in fact, if you look in many, many different Bibles, they'll translate Hashmal as electrum. But they don't mean electricity, even though we translate it today as electricity. They meant it as a blue color. And that's why, as I remember seeing in one of these Crayola crayons, one of the blues was called electrum. It was called electrum. But now we want to go even deeper. In the teachings of the Arizal, as given over by Rabbi Chaim Vital, there's nothing in the writings of the Arizal before the contraction, before the tzimtzum. The Rabbi Chaim Vital, who is his main student, and we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude, because without him, we may have lost the teachings of the Arizal, because he didn't write anything. So the whole, what we call Kitvei Ha'ari, the writings of the Ari, comes through Rabbi Chaim Vital. But he didn't include anything of what the Arizal said or hinted to about before the contraction. But other students of the Arizal, they have a tradition that they did hear from the Arizal, and it does appear in books. And the most important one is called Emek, my mind just went blank. You'll have to excuse me. Emek HaMelech. Emek HaMelech, the depths of the king, or the valley of the king. Emek HaMelech. And in there, he describes teachings that the author of Emek HaMelech was a student of the Arizal. And so he heard it from the student. And many Kabbalists don't go there. They stick with Rabbi Chaim Vital, and they don't go to anything before the contraction, when God contracted the infinite light in order to make a space of the world. But others do, especially Chabad. Chabad accepts these teachings as authentic and legitimate and delves into them. And in different teachings of Rav Ginsburg, he delves very deeply into it. Now, why am I mentioning all of this? Is because the numerical value for Hashmal also equals the word called malbush, a clothing. Malbush is a clothing. Lovesh means to clothe oneself. So why this is important is because in Emek HaMelech, he describes different levels, as it were, within God's thought process that leads to the creation of the world. Now, obviously, these are very high, deep, profound levels of trying to understand as it were, the thought process of God, which leads to the creation of the world. And so in Emek HaMelech, he labels like this reality, Olam HaMalbush, the world of enclothement. And of course, this is alluding to Hashmal, the primordial source of Hashmal. We spoke about darkness and then light, and then darkness and light. And the first darkness is the Ein Sof, is we don't, there's actually a tremendous discussion in Kabbalah. Is Ein Sof the essence of God? Or is the Ein Sof, in a certain way, also a creation of the essence of God? How much more so the or Ein Sof? So when we get to the essence, we really know nothing. That's beyond our ability to understand. Nonetheless, Olam HaMalbush is explained in Emek HaMelech as Shi'er ba'atzmo b'koach kol ma she'atid liyot b'foel. That this world of enclothement is, God is estimating to himself in potential everything that in the future would come into reality. In other words, when we say God looked into the Torah and created the world, well, what does that mean exactly? So the metaphor is just like a person who wants to build a building. So let's just imagine someone just bought a piece of land, and they're standing on the piece of land. There's no house there, and of course they want to build a house there. They're standing there, and they see it in a vision. They see exactly what the house is going to look like. Well, what does he do now? He has to get an architect and make plans. And so here, Olam HaMalbush, and here we're getting to really like the primordial source of the concept of Hashmal, is out of that darkness, the Chash, the Mal is everything that will come in the future from the inception of that vision. Here, as it were, it's the vision of God. And what are the architectural plans? The Torah. God looked into the Torah and created the world. That's the black fire on white fire. And so, and I'm taking from Rav Ginsburg here, Rav Ginsburg explains that this is the source of the Hebrew letters is in this place called Olam HaMalbush. That is where the letters become the vessels for the light of God in creating the world. That the letters are vessels. And when we look at the Torah and we read the Torah and we study the Torah, so we're reading the letters which are vessels for the light and the ratzon and the will of God. The light and the will of God is shining through the letters. And so in this place where God is estimating in potential everything that would be in the future, well, there has to be a mechanism to get potential to reality. And that is the Hebrew letters. And they're coming from this pre-symptom, pre-contraction, all in the, as it were, the thought of God. This is where it's all happening. But again, the word malbush implies a clothing. And so this becomes the beginning of the vessels that eventually translate into the physical material world. And so Hashmal, in its primordial source, is, again, remember, Mal means speaking. And here God is going to speak the world into creation. And the Chash is the pure potential. Chash is the potential. And Rav Ginsburg makes one other point here that's important, where if you think about infinite, this is what the Arizal was trying to address. How is an infinite God going to create a finite world? They're mutually exclusive. If it's infinite, how it can't be finite. Finite is like the opposite of infinite. And that's why the Ari had explained this whole idea of contraction, that God had to make a space in which, as it were, to put a finite world. But that finite world is still part of the infinite light of God. But to us, it appears to be somewhat separate. That's our whole challenge. That's why it's to the point that someone can be completely unaware of God and could even be anti-God or not believe in God or be radically against the idea of a creator. That's how much free will that God gave us. That's how much finiteness God allows in his world. But you have a problem. If God can't be finite, then he's not infinite. Because if you say there's something that God can't do or be, then he's no longer infinite. So the whole idea of finiteness is actually part of infiniteness. But God had to draw that out in a way. And that to do that took what was called the contraction. So here, I'm just going to go back and we're going to tie this together. When we said that chashmal, in its most simple reading, means the speaking silence. So here we see this idea of trying to understand how chashmal equals malbush. So this touches on from potential to actual, from silence to speech, from, as I said, potential to actual. But there's a process there. And that's where this chashmal comes in. We're dealing with chashmal. You have to remember what we said is Ezekiel is seeing Ma'aseh Merkavah in the world of Yetzirah. Daniel, there are four worlds. Remember the material physical world, the world of formation, the world of creation, the world of emanation. So here in the physical material world, that's where Daniel and Zechariah had their vision of the Merkavah, but in terms, in metaphors, in symbolism of this world. Ezekiel was already on a higher level. So he is in contact with this energy called Hashmal and all of the angels that he's going to describe. Isaiah was even on a higher level. And we explained this already. But I did mention the first time there was only one person who was able to see the Merkavah on the level of emanation. And that was Moshe Rabbeinu. Only Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see on that purest level. That's why it says God spoke to him face to face, mouth to mouth. Only Moshe was able to see it. But here, and this is what I'll end with, so most of this class, we were dealing with Hashmal as it manifests in this world, all of the opposites, the paradoxes. In later classes, we'll go even deeper into this. But here, this last section, and I admit it's very, very ethereal, very profound, very deep. This idea of Olam HaMalbush, the world of enclothement. But I'll end with a saying from the Maggid when he was talking about the four worlds. And we tend to look at the four worlds as being hierarchical. We're down here in this world, and then there's a higher world and a higher world, and then the highest world. And they're like different realities altogether. There is a certain truth to that, but the Maggid said, Atzilut, the highest world, is here. They're all here. They're all here. So tonight, we took Hashmal, like we bumped it up to a very, very high level, but it's here. It's here. Infinite and finite are both here. So I'll end with a blessing. And the blessing is that we're all confronted with paradoxes. We're all confronted with seemingly opposite realities that are sometimes very, very hard to bring together. But in the Shema, when we talk about heaven on earth, so one of the ideas is this idea of coming to understand how Judaism looks at paradox and to bring heaven down to earth, to bring a reality where fire and water are not necessarily mutually exclusive, or they can coexist together. And that's ultimately what the Mashiach will do. The Mashiach will bring a type of teaching to the world that will bring everyone to the same page. Everyone will be able to relate to what he's saying because he will be able to bring all of the opposites that people think together and show how they can coexist in a world of peace. May we see it soon and in our days.